Alright, so I went out of my way to make this creepy eyeball for you guys. The purpose of the eyeball is to re-emphasize that the eyeball is indeed a sphere. It's a ball. I think some people kind of forget that. It's something that I remind myself of too. So let's go back to the basics and talk about how you make a sphere an actual sphere. Well, it should have a form shadow, a midtone, a highlight, right? Those are some of the things it should have. Maybe even some reflected light. Now, when you're drawing the eye, it's really important that the top lid closes over the iris and the bottom lid either comes very close to it or actually does close over the iris as well. Here you're looking at an exaggeration of what happens when you don't. That eye looks alarmed, like something scary and pokey is coming towards it. Here's what the eye typically looks like when it's not in an alarmed state. So you can see that there's a top lid and a bottom lid. I want to show you that the top lid of the eye actually projects. It's thick. And so is the bottom lid. The bottom lid is kind of like a pocket and it's surrounding that underside of the sphere. So there's kind of a little bit of a bag under most people's eyes. Of course, it's going to be way more pronounced on some people than on others, so there's always a variation there. But that because that top lid is thick, it projects and casts a little bit of a shadow. That shadow can be exaggerated further when you add eyelashes. I'm just sticking a fan brush on here to show you how the eyelashes work, but they do create this kind of effect where there's like a partial shadow over the top part of the eye. You don't get that on the bottom because the lashes kind of actually curve away, so they're not casting a shadow. That means that in most scenarios, there's going to be a darker area at the top half of the eye. That includes the iris and maybe a tiny bit of the pupil. That pink thing that's in the corner of the eye, that's called a caruncle. I didn't come up with a name, it's just the anatomical term. Alright, so we're first going to the pupil. And you'll need to use a tiny brush for this, either the one with the kind of yellow-orange handle or there's one with kind of a redder handle. Either one will do. And remember, a pupil is black. And we don't have black, but there's alternatives to black, right? We can make our own purple and add some yellow to it and maybe a dot more red. We can add dark brown and dark blue together and maybe a little bit of something else to it as well. I think I used a combination of those. Someone in the class, I'm sure, has a great recipe for black, and there's multiple ones, so you could always go primaries. Anyway, I'm getting that pupil in. I did notice that the pupil on the top is 1 degree lighter than the pupil on the bottom, and that's just the lighting scenario. We're just doing an eyeball today, so there's no actual skin projecting over it, but when we do get to the eyeball, it's going to be fun because there's going to be that little porch created by the eyelid itself sticking beyond the eye. So I'm looking at the pupil, and the design inside the iris is radial, which means it's kind of like a wagon wheel. There's spokes on a wagon wheel like emanating from one point. Kind of the same deal here. There's a sort of rim too, which is what I'm getting in here. That rim is kind of a murky blue, green, gray. And on one side, I think it's the right side, it's darker. On the left side, it's lighter. That's because the eyeball is in form shadow on the right and it's in light to the left. So the point of doing the eyeball is to get you to think of the eye not just as a flat element, but as a three-dimensional one. Plus, eyeballs are kind of fun too. When you're doing that perimeter, you need to think of a couple of things, kind of curving your stroke to wrap it around in a circular fashion and to also vary up your hues. So I'm not just using one color here. There's a lighter shade, there's a greener shade, there's a browner shade, all within that one outer circle. And then you're going to start to work your way in towards that pupil, which is really fun. There, I saw blues, I saw greens, I saw a little variation with a earthy kind of tone, so adding some browns or warms to it as well. This is the first layer. Ultimately, I'd love it if you guys put 2 on here because you're going to see that iris is going to look a little transparent and with another coat or two, it'll look way more solid and a lot better. The ring around the pupil is actually very warm, so it's kind of a muddy, murky brown. I used a little bit of violet in my brown too, I believe, and some yellow ochre. But then the iris itself is predominantly blue-green with a few earth tones. And there is going to be a slight highlight there, but I'm not going to pop that in yet. I'm going to wait till a little bit later. So now you should be able to see that on the left side, it's a little bit lighter. On the right side, it's sort of in shadow. And there's kind of a haziness around the iris itself. So on the edge of the iris, the rim transitions into like this hazy kind of gray. So I'm going to try and do that too, because I don't want that to be a sharp edge. I don't want it to look like someone just cut out an iris and glued it on. I want it to look like it's embedded into the sphere. And now I'm going for that form shadow, and I switched to a bigger brush here. So you could use a filbert. Filberts are brilliant at doing shading and transitioning and getting a gradation, which is what we're doing. This is basically a gradient that we're going from form shadow into mid-tone into light. It's important that you put some warms in there. The eyeball that I gave you guys to look at as a reference has a lot of red on it because of all the veins. It's trying to document it faithfully to life. You don't have to put the veins on. In fact, I chose to not put those in. Now what I would like you to focus on is curving your stroke and wrapping it around the form. This goes back to our first fruit paintings. So making sure your stroke is actually curving around that form. You need to suggest a sphere, a ball. So in order to do that, you have to help by wrapping your stroke around there. It's also about values and transitions. This is not exactly a perfect transition. In fact, it's an abrupt one. So I'm going to go back in and layer it and get that to be a smoother transition. So here's what it looks like when there are 2 or more layers. So in some places I built it up even more than the 2 layers, especially around the iris and the pupil and that area. So you want to build your layers up. You want to have an iris where you can see the rim, you can see the interior, you can see that transition to the pupil and a highlight there. You also want that eye to really look like a sphere, like a ball. It is up to you if you want to put the veins on. That's totally your choice. I opted not to, but I did leave like a tinge of kind of red on the side there. And you want to think about those things like warm colors pop out, cool colors recede, because I use like in the white part of the eye, there's sort of a highlight, and I used a warm there. I used kind of a yellow peachy color to help pop that out. And in the shadow side, where it recedes, I used more of a cooler gray. And of course, you're making that gray yourself with blue, red, yellow, and white.